Welcome back to another episode of JailBreak Overlander. I'm Richie, and this is JailBreak. And in this episode, I'm going to answer a question that I get in the comments more than any others. I've traveled from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the Canadian border down to the Sinaloan Desert in Mexico. And the main thing people want to ask is, have I ever seen a Bigfoot? Well, I've been in a lot of remote locations, and I've seen a lot of crazy stuff. And everything isn't always as it seems. So to answer this, it's going to be a long video, but I've got some footage that I've been holding on to for over a year. And in this video, you're going to see it. This is going to be a good video, so you are going to want to sit back, relax, and check this out. Okay, so for most people, getting out into nature means throwing a fishing line into a lake, maybe stopping at a central park or a park and hanging out on a blanket, or perhaps throwing a tent up in the local wooded area. Well, for me, it's a little different. I want to go to places where nobody else has been, and in this day and age, that's really tough to do. But I try. And I love wildlife, any type of wildlife, and I'm looking for the rarer, the better. How about that? And again, in this day and age, it's hard to do. But let's get back to the story at hand. Bigfoot, the Dogman, Voodoo, etc. What is Bigfoot? What is a Dogman? Well, they fall under the category of things called a cryptid. It's an animal such as a Sasquatch or a Loch Ness monster that has been claimed to exist but never been proven to exist by science. So there you go. But I'll tell you what, a lot of people have seen, written, discussed, and talked about Bigfoot, the Dogman, Yetis, etc. And you'd be surprised. People like, I don't know, Theodore Roosevelt. Ever heard of him? He was a president. And he wrote a couple of books, and he did a lot of things, but he wrote this one particular book called The Wilderness Hunter. And this book wasn't about Bigfoot, it was about the wilderness. How to survive outside, how to tell different animals from another one, tracking, how to survive a mountain lion attack, etc. But in this book, he had a particular story called the Bowman story. And I'm going to read you this. It's about a 10-minute story, but you're going to want to hear this because this guy wasn't some wacko. He was the president of the United States, and he was well respected. And this is his take on it. From the Wilderness Hunter. Frontiersmen are not, as a rule, apt to be very superstitious. They lead lives too hard and practical and have too little imagination in spiritual and the supernatural. I have heard but few ghost stories while living on the frontier, and those few were of perfectly commonplace and conventional type. But I once listened to a goblin story which rather impressed me. A grizzled, weather-beaten old mountain hunter named Bowman, who, born and had passed all his life on the frontier, told the story to me. He must have believed what he said, for he could hardly repress a shudder at certain points of the tale. But he was of German ancestry and in childhood had doubtless been saturated with all kinds of ghost and goblin lore, so that many fearsome superstitions were latent in his mind. Besides, he knew well the stories told by the Indian medicine men in their winter camps of the snow walkers and the specters, the formless evil beings that haunt the forest depths and dog and waylay the lonely wanderer who after nightfall passes through the regions where they lurk. It may be that when overcome by the horror of the fate that befell his friend, and when oppressed by the awful dread of the unknown, he grew to attribute, both at the time and still more in remembrance, weird and elfin traits to what was merely some abnormally wicked and cunning wild beast. But whether this was so or not, no man can say. When the event occurred, Bowman was still a young man and was trapping with a partner among the mountains dividing the fork of the Salmon from the head of Wisdom River. Not having had much luck, he and his partner determined to go up into a particularly wild and lonely pass through which ran a small stream said to contain many beavers. The pass had an evil reputation because the year before a solitary hunter who had wandered into this was slain, seemingly by a wild beast, the half-eaten remains being afterwards found by some mining prospectors who had passed his camp only the night before. The memory of this event, however, weighed very lightly with the two trappers, who were as adventurous and hardy as others of their kind. They took their two lean mountain ponies to the foot of the pass, where they left them in an open beaver meadow, the rocky timber-clad ground being from there onward impracticable for horses. They then struck out on foot through the vast, gloomy forest, and in about 4 hours reached a little open glade where they concluded to camp, as signs of game were plenty. Now I'm reading this all to you for a point. This is from an ex-president, and this wasn't the point of his book. His book wasn't about Bigfoot. It was about the wilderness, and this was just one story that he thought was important enough to include in his book. But I digress. There was still an hour of two of daylight left, and after building a brush lean-to and throwing down and opening their packs, they started upstream. The country was very dense and hard to travel through, as there was much down timber, although here and there the somber woodland was broken by small glades of mountain grass. At dusk they again reached camp. The glade in which it was pitched was not many yards wide, the tall, close-set pines and firs rising around it like a wall. On one side was a little stream, beyond which rose the steep mountain slopes, covered with unbroken growth of evergreen forest. They were surprised to find that during their absence, something, apparently a bear, had visited camp, and had rummaged about among their things, scattering the contents of their packs in sheer wantonness, destroying their lean-to. The footprints of the beast were quite plain, but at first they paid no particular heed to them, busying themselves instead with rebuilding the lean-to, laying out their beds and stores, and lighting the fire. While Bowman was making ready supper, it being already dark, his companion began to examine the tracks more closely, and soon took a brand from the fire to follow them up, where the intruder had walked along a game trail after leaving the camp. When the brand flickered out, he returned and took another, repeating his inspection of the footprints very closely. Coming back to the fire, he stood by it a minute or two, peering out into the darkness, and suddenly remarked, "Bowman, that bear has been walking on 2 legs." Now Bowman laughed at this, but his partner insisted that he was right, and upon again examining the tracks with a torch, they certainly did seem to be made by but 2 paws or feet. However, it was too dark to make sure. After discussing whether the footprints could possibly be those of a human being and coming to the conclusion they could not be, the 2 men rolled up in their blankets and went to sleep under the lean-to. At midnight, Bowman was awakened by some noise and sat up in his blankets. As he did so, his nostrils were struck by a strong, wild beast odor, and he caught the loom of a great body in the darkness at the mouth of the lean-to. Grabbing his rifle, he fired at the vague, threatening shadow, but must have missed, for immediately afterwards he heard the smashing of the underwood as the thing, whatever it was, rushed off into the impenetrable blackness of the forest and night. Now after this, the 2 men slept but little, sitting up by the rekindled fire, but they heard nothing more. In the morning, they started out to look at the few traps they had set the previous evening and began to put out new ones. By an unspoken agreement, they kept together all day and returned to the camp towards evening. On nearing it, they saw, hardly to their astonishment, that the lean-to had again been torn down. The visitor of the preceding day had returned, and in wanton malice had tossed about their camp kit and bedding and destroyed the shanty again. The ground was marked up by its tracks, and on leaving the camp it had gone along the soft earth by the brook. The footprints were as plain as if on snow, and after careful scrutiny of the trail, it certainly did seem as if, whatever the thing was, it had walked off on 2 legs. The men, thoroughly uneasy, gathered a great heap of dead logs and kept up a roaring fire throughout the night, one or the other sitting up on guard most of the time. About midnight, the thing came down through the forest opposite across the brook and stayed there on the hillside for nearly an hour. They could hear the branches crackle as it moved about, and several times it uttered a harsh, grating, long-drawn moan, a peculiarly sinister sound. Yet it did not venture near the fire. In the morning, the 2 trappers, after discussing the strange events of the last 36 hours, decided they would shoulder their packs and leave the valley that afternoon. They were more than ready to do this because, in spite of seeing a good deal of game sign, they had caught very little. However, it was necessary first to go along the line of their traps and gather them up. And this they started out to do. All the morning they kept together, picking up trap after trap, each one empty. On first leaving camp, they had the disagreeable sensation of being followed. In the dense spruce thickets, they were occasionally heard a branch snapped after they had passed, and now and then there were slight rustling noises among the small pines to one side of them. At noon, they were back within a couple of miles of camp. In the high, bright sunlight, their fear seemed absurd to the 2 armed men, accustomed as they were, through long years of lonely wandering in the wilderness, to face every kind of danger from man, brute, or element. There were still 3 beaver traps to collect from a little pond in a wide ravine nearby. Bowman volunteered to gather these and bring them in, while his companion went ahead to camp and made ready the packs. On reaching the pond, Bowman found 3 beavers in the traps, one of which had been pulled loose and carried into a beaver house. He took several hours in securing and preparing the beaver, and when he started homewards, he marked, with some uneasiness, how low the sun was getting. As he hurried toward camp under the tall trees, the silence and desolation of the forest weighed on him. His feet made no sound on the pine needles, and the slanting sun rays striking through among the straight tree trunks made a gray twilight in which objects at a distance glimmered indistinctively. There was nothing to break the gloomy stillness which, when there is no breeze, always broods over these somber, primeval forests. At last he came to the edge of the little glade where the camp lay, and he shouted as he approached, but got no answer. The campfire had gone out, though the thin blue smoke was still curling upwards. Near it lay the packs wrapped and arranged. At first Bowman could see nobody, nor did he receive an answer to his call. Stepping forward, he again shouted, and as he did so, his eye fell on the body of his friend, stretched beside the trunk of a great fallen spruce. Rushing forward, the horrified trapper found out the body was still warm, but that the neck was broken, while there were 4 great fang marks in the throat. The footprints of the unknown beast creature printed deep in the soft soil told the whole story. The unfortunate man, having finished his packing, had sat down on the spruce log with his face to the fire and his back to the woods to wait for his companion. While he was waiting, the monstrous assailant, which must have been lurking in the woods, waiting for a chance to catch one of the men unprepared, came silently up from behind him, walking with noiseless steps and seemingly still on 2 legs, Evidently unheard, it reached the man and broke his neck by wrenching his head backwards with one paw, while it buried its teeth deep in his throat. It didn't eat the body, but apparently romped and gimbaled all around it in uncouth, ferocious glee. Occasionally rolling over and over it, it had then fled back into the soundless depths of the woods. Bowman, utterly unnerved and believing the creature with which he had to deal with was something either half human or half devil, some great goblin beast, abandoned everything but his rifle and struck off at speed down the pass, not halting until he reached the beaver meadows where the hobbled ponies were still grazing. He jumped on his horse and rode through the night until he was beyond the reach of pursuit. Now, Roosevelt never gives the name of the creatures other than calling it a goblin, but contemporary readers will instantly note that it sounds a lot like Bigfoot, the hairiest, smelliest, biggest upright walking ape-like creature to ever reportedly stalk the mountains and forests of the Americas. So I know that was a long story, but it's to set the table, basically. Not only did Roosevelt write a book mentioning Bigfoot, but this book right here called The Long Walk by Slavomir Rauwix is an escape from a Soviet gulag. And if you'll notice right there on page 253, there's a point in the book during their escape where they have to stop and wait for two large white fur-covered naked yetis to get out of the way. Now, this book was about escaping from a gulag. It's already got enough adventure. I mean, it won a Pulitzer, I believe. It's already got enough adventure and everything else. This guy didn't make this up. It's just an observation. While they were escaping, they ran into a couple of yetis. So, there you go. And pictures and video of Bigfoot and Yeti prints have been found everywhere. And you're looking at them right now. That's an actual picture. I didn't take it. But drawings like this, petroglyphs, etc., have been going on since men figured out how to put designs on rocks, set in stone. Now, these pictures right here you're looking at, I did take. Now, notice, on the left-hand side, it has 5 toes. On the right-hand side, it has 6 toes. Now, that goes right back to many biblical writings that talk about 6-fingered, 6-toed giant creatures that roam this land. So there is a precedent. And just because science in the mainstream doesn't talk about it, they can't, because it would ruin their entire story of evolution. At any rate, let's get into Voodoo's, SCARECROWS, and Dogmen, all down in the Louisiana Bayou. Now, this was done by me, and this was all firsthand. So, hold on, here we go. So this past February in 2020, I visited a friend of mine down in Louisiana who happened to live on the Bayou. And I loved this. Even though it was February, there were still gators, there were still all sorts of tropical birds. And we wanted to go fishing, and we wanted to go get some footage of alligators, etc., so forth, so on, blah, blah, blah. And we did. I love this stuff. I'm like a 5-year-old. Now, we're way out here in the bayou. I mean, these are tight little offshoots of the main waterway. And it's February, so it's wintertime for the bayou folks. But to me, it's beautiful out. There's gators, there's turtles, there's all sorts of cool stuff. Plus, with nobody around, I'm learning how to fly the drone and land the drone on a moving boat. So it was good practice. So we spent several days out here checking out all sorts of stuff, and it was phenomenal. The beauty of the Louisiana Bayou is astounding, as long as you know the rules, because there are some rules. Now, I live on the Atlantic Ocean, so I'm familiar with the Atlantic, boats, etc. Been on them all my life. One thing about this is, while we're cruising through here, I notice an owl through all this brush. Believe it or not, I saw it. and I jumped out of the boat. Well, there's one thing I didn't know. Unlike back home, when you jump out of the boat onto the beach, it isn't a beach, it's quicksand. And believe it or not, we're flying. I mean, look at me, I'm soaked, I'm covered in quicksand, and I was sinking. I managed to stop myself and get back in the boat. But the reason we pulled over was because while we were cruising by at 40 miles an hour or whatever it was, I noticed an owl in a tree. And he didn't believe me, but there it was. I definitely saw it a mile away. You guys know how I love owls. But I mean, I was covered with this disgustingly stinky stuff. It sucked. My face is all sunburned. It was awesome. But long story short, I was getting some really, really good footage that day. So it all worked out. I was kind of pissed off because I wanted to make sure he had the camera running, because what's better than getting Richie from Boston stuck in quicksand in a Louisiana bayou? Not too many things, right? At any rate, on with the story. So after the quicksand episode, we went back to his house. I had to take a shower and clean my clothes, and we headed back out on the water. We were out there for 2 or 3 solid days, I forget. But we were fortunate enough to catch this brown pelican. Now, this is Louisiana's state bird. I did not know that. And he had lived down here his whole life, the kid that was driving the boat, and he had never seen one. This thing was massive. It was massive. I couldn't believe it. It was the biggest bird I've ever seen, ever. And when it took off, it looked like a pterodactyl. I'm not even exaggerating slightly. This was a large bird, and they eat meat. So there you go. You didn't know that? Now you do. See that? JailBreak Overlander, teaching you something new every day. At any rate, he didn't like me watching him with the camera, and he took off, which was awesome because, again, like a pterodactyl, he was enormous. So we keep moving down the bayou, and we come across some amazingly colorful and beautiful spoonbill plovers. Yeah, I just said that. Spoonbill plovers. And they were absolutely beautiful. Now, for those that are really impatient and they're going, dude, what the F does this have to do with Bigfoot, Dogman, or Voodoo? Stand by. We're getting there, okay? This is called building it up, and that's exactly what I'm doing, because this all led up to what I'm about to show you. So we're out in the bayou. I fall in the quicksand. We see some really cool stuff, things you don't see every day, and we come around a corner, and I mean, we're in the middle of nowhere. And I've already discovered the hard way that you can't get out of the boat unless you're wearing waders and you know what type of ground it is, because it's all quicksand. So after getting soaking wet, dunked in quicksand, and getting video of gators absolutely everywhere doing all types of stuff gators do, I was pretty stoked. But we were way, way, way away from his house, so he knew a shortcut. Now, the bayou is just like a neighborhood, except instead of streets and highways and byways, you have large waterways and then branches all over the place where the roads or the waterways get really, really tight. And you can easily get lost. No two ways about it. So, the fella driving the boat decided to show me some shortcuts, and that's what we did. Took some shortcuts, and we ran into some really creepy landscape, we'll call it. We were in such a tight little bayou, you could almost reach out of the boat and touch shores on either side. But again, you couldn't get out of the boat because there's nowhere to get out of the boat. Anything that looks like sand that's next to the water is quicksand, and you don't want to stand in it. How do I know? Exactly. Refer back to me standing in quicksand like a jackass. I suppose in the summertime this is really beautiful, but this is February. So all there is Spanish moss hanging on the trees, and it just gives a really, really creepy feel to it. Plus, you're all alone out there. You're in water that's surrounded by alligators. Being a city boy, even though I grew up on the water, I'm still not too stoked about falling in the water, because back home, if you fall in the water, there aren't any alligators. but out here there is. But I was soon to find out that alligators weren't the biggest problem out here. Apparently, there's other problems. And you'll see what I'm talking about very shortly. Now he's driving the boat and I'm scanning the water lines with the cameras, getting footage. That's what I do. I get footage. And I'm looking at all the creepy trees and I'm looking for gators and such. And what I'm about to see, I did not think I would see in a million years. And there it is, hanging on that tree right there. What the hell is that? So we slow down the boat and we roll up to it. Now notice the ground next to the tree. There's a werewolf hanging on the tree. And I'm thinking, well, that's kind of weird. You know, this isn't a waterway that people frequent whatsoever at all. So it's kind of crazy, but, you know, it is what it is. It happens. Well, turns out we ran into more than one of these. We ran into several of these, and he started to explain the story. He told me that people that practice voodoo put these scarecrows, that's what that is, it's a scarecrow, they put these up there to scare away the Dogman, or the Rigaroo, or whatever it's called. What do you think of them apples? So if people practicing voodoo need to put scarecrows up in places where you can't stand on the ground because it's water, this is a very difficult thing to do. So I started looking into it, and Louisiana voodoo, also known as New Orleans voodoo, describes a set of underground religious practices which originated from the traditions of African diaspora. It is a cultural form of Afro-American religions which developed within the French, Spanish, and Creole-speaking African-American population of the U.S. state of Louisiana. It is one of the many incarnations of African-based religions rooted in West African Dahamian voodoo. They became syncretized with the Catholicism and Francophone culture of South Louisiana as a result of the slave trade. Yeah, so there's that. But what is this Dogman they're trying to scare away? And here's another question. What are the voodoo practicing people doing in these woods where I can't get? What are they doing out there that they're out there so often that the Dogman is such a problem that they have to put up scarecrows? And they have to go through great pains to put up these scarecrows because there's a lot of work involved. It's not just stuck up there with Velcro. They built frames on it, they do blessings, etc. There's quite a bit to it. So I started looking into the Dogman of Louisiana, if it was even a thing. Now, it falls under the category of cryptids that I talked about earlier. And before I did this video, I knew people were just going to laugh and blow it off. But let me tell you something. If people escaping from Russian gulags during World War II, where they're on foot from Russia through the Himalayas, they're writing this book about their escape and everything, and they just happen to mention having to sit and wait for an hour while two Yetis finished foraging, and then they were able to safely pass. And then you've got people like Teddy Roosevelt writing a book on how to survive in the wilderness, and he just so mentions a story about Bigfoot killing a trapper. The stories go back in the United States for time immemorial, and I do not believe whatsoever at all that Bigfoot is some undiscovered monkey. You see what I mean? Because why would a country hide the fact that there's a giant 2-foot monkey walking around when every other country just calls them gorillas and monkeys and everything else? You see what I'm saying? Does it make any sense? At any rate, let's look into what this Dogman thing even is, shall we? And before people just write this off, this has made it to the news. Do you see what I'm saying? There's more of these reports than people seem to understand. More than I understood, at least. And the Dogman, more commonly known as the Rougarou, even has its own Wikipedia page, and it says the stories of the creature known as the Rougarou are as diverse as the spelling of its name, though they are all connected to the Francophone cultures through a common derived belief in the loup-garou. Loup is French for wolf, and garou is a man who transforms into an animal. And again, apparently it's so common that there's a Dogman Encounters website dedicated to it, as well as this website that shows the numerous encounters that people have had all over the United States. It seems to be specifically in the United States. Now, I for one have never run into one. The closest I've come is the numerous werewolf scarecrows that were in the most remote spots in the Bayou. I never knew this was a thing. With my other YouTube channels over the years, people would send me reports of Dogmans, and I would just basically laugh at them saying, sure you saw a Dogman, you probably had a bottle of scotch on you too. Well, strangely enough, me making jokes like that, when you see the actual scarecrow itself, it does have a bottle in its pocket. It's part of the voodoo. You see what I'm saying? And there were 4 of these total, and these were difficult to put up because there's no place to stand. These are pretty substantial setups, and people believe in this. Now, do I believe in it? I've never seen the Dogman, but I sure have seen the evidence of time, energy, and effort people in the Bayou have put in to keeping the Dogman, no pun intended, at bay. At any rate, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like, share, and subscribe. I will leave as many links as I possibly can in the description below. Leave a comment, and I will return the favor. I am out.